it, Doc. Why did you have to tear up that letter? I only had more time. Wait a minute. I got all the time I want. I got a time machine. I can just go back early and warn him.
So at this point, we've laid enough groundwork that we can see how many of these years at the end lined up in God's timeline for the end. And we can see some of the pivotal dates and also some of the pivotal numbers that God uses to map these things out. With that in mind, I wanted to do one more study before we get into, well, actually two more studies before we get into the Back to the Future analysis, because again, all these puzzle pieces are going to be required to see what God has hidden in that film. And we're going to have to see that God declares the end from the beginning. Basically, we see that here in Isaiah 46:10. It says, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times the things that are not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will do all my pleasure. And again, just for those of you who don't know, the word times is actually word 10 in this verse, which is God's number for time, and it's also in verse 10. So again, you'll often see the number 10 associated with the theme of time or times. There's also 29 words in this verse, and 29 is the 10th prime number. But at any rate, the end is linked to a sequence that began in 2022, which we previously covered, which God often encodes as 222. We're going to see how that comes up, but we're going to see another place where this number 46 is also linked to the end. It's here we read in John 2:20-22. Then said the Jews, 46 years was this temple in building, and wilt thou rear it up in 3 days? But he spake of the temple of his body. When therefore he was risen from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this unto them, and they believed the scripture and the word which Jesus had said. Ultimately, the end is linked to a second reckoning of 2022, which can be identified as the 2022 reset or the second 2022. And just remember, God knows how we look at his word. He knows that when we look at this passage, we are going to see 2:20-22 or two 2022s. Again, this requires faith, and obviously you're not going to see this piece of the puzzle unless you've seen a lot of the other pieces of the puzzle that God has provided. But I'm trying to help get us through this or guide us through this just so we can see what God is laying out. And we can see that it's in John. John is book 43. Remember, in 43 is 23 plus 20 or 20 plus 23. It's related to the sequence that's connected to the rapture. And so there are many sequences in the rapture linked to the rapture that are found in the Gospel of John, because it is book 43. And also Isaiah is book 23, which is a shorthand reference to that. But at any rate, there's a lot going on here. Obviously, in the literal historic sense, Jesus Christ was talking about being raised 3 literal 24-hour days from the dead. However, it's also talking about the temple of his body. And remember, the body of Christ, the church, is his body in the greater redemptive context. And we are raised on the third day, or a day is as 1,000 years in God's redemptive plan, the third day from the cross. And so, really, this is a twofold prophecy in this passage. One is concerning the head, Jesus Christ, who was raised in 3 24-hour days. The other is concerning his body, the church, which is raised on the third day from the cross on the millennial calendar, and that is really linked to, again, to 2022s. There's 2 references to 222 are actually encoded in Isaiah 46:10. The following phrases have an English ordinal value of 222. We can see the end from the beginning, Isaiah, and we also see Isaiah 46:10. I'm going to show that really quick, actually, just so you guys can see at least some evidence for some of this. So if I type in the end from the beginning and calculate its value, you can see that it actually is 222 in simple or ordinal English. Likewise, if I type in Isaiah 46:10, which is the verse that declares the end from the beginning, you can see that it is also 222 in simple English ordinal values. And so, and this shows that God is sovereign over all languages, not just Hebrew and Greek, but he's sovereign over English as well. And just as God codifies with Hebrew and Greek, God also codifies with English. In this case, if we look at the values, the end from the beginning has a value of 222, which is related to that end sequence. Furthermore, the word yet in this verse, I'll show it really quick here. we can see that the word yet is word 253 in the chapter, which is the triangle number of 22. So there's, he's saying that the completion of 22, this 22 sequence, is not yet complete, but it is something that will be complete, something that God has declared from the beginning. I mentioned that right here. Yeah, the word yet is also word 253 in the chapter, and it is the 325th mention of yet in the Bible. And so 325 is 13 times 25, a reference to the seven thunders. It's also, and then it's in the 315th verse that the word yet occurs in, and that is 7 times 45, or 7 times 20 plus 25. So the fullness of 2025. Again, the years 2022 and 2025 are connected to each other in the sequence at the end. In turn, these years are connected to another year that is declared from the beginning, which we're going to see here in just a sec. Genesis 1:1 is the beginning of God's word, and it declares the end. It basically says, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Here it is in Hebrew. And as a note, Hebrew is read from right to left. So this over here is actually the end. Genesis 1:1 ends with the letter Tzaddi. Alternatively, it's spelled Tsade in English for us. Tsade gets its name from a fishing hook, which it resembles in its non-Sophite form. The name is connected to its root Zod, which means hunt, catch, or capture. And God is going to catch or capture us in the rapture. So one thing, if you guys aren't aware, there's certain letters in Hebrew, I believe there's 7, that have what they call Sophite forms, which means if they come at the end of a word, then they will look different than they do otherwise. This is one case where actually in this verse it would hang down, but typically though the Tsade would, this would be the Sophite form of that letter. But typically though, Tsade looks like this, and it was meant to represent a primitive or ancient fishing hook. And here it is in manual print, if you guys want to see what that looks like. The ancient pictograph for Tsade is a man lying on his side. Remember, Hebrew went through several stages, but the ancient pictograph for Tsade is a man lying on his side. This is also loosely reflected in the modern letter symbol, which you can kind of see is still somewhat retained. This depiction relates to the meaning of Tzaddi as it represents a man in need. Tzaddi represents a righteous man who has humbled himself before God. The Tzaddi connection to righteousness is exemplified in Psalms 119. So most of you know Psalms 119 goes through each of the 22 Hebrew letters of the alphabet. And the Tzaddi begins in verse 137. And I'm not going to go through this whole passage. You guys can read it if you want. But it's talking about righteousness. Like it mentions righteous here, righteous, being thy word is very pure. It's worth noting that one of the ways God represents his word is the number 35. 140 is divisible by 35. So you can see that it's 4 times 35. There's just many cases where God will use the number 35 to represent his word. In this case, he's saying thy word is very pure. Another place, obviously, is like if you go to Proverbs 30, verse 5, it says every word of God is pure, and 30 plus 5 is 35. And so there's just many examples. Another one I like, I'll go to Hosea, book 28, which is appropriate for what we're about ready to get into. I think it's 8. Let me see. Or maybe it's Amos. It might be Amos now that I think about it. Well, anyway, since I can't find it right off the top of my head, I'm going to leave it aside for another time. But one thing I want to mention, though, if I go to Isaiah 34, which talks about the book of the Lord, we go down to verse 16. It says, "Seek ye out of the book of the Lord." So this is the only place where the book of the Lord is referenced. "Seek ye out of the book of the Lord and read. No one of these shall fail. None shall want her mate, for my mouth it hath commanded, and his spirit hath gathered them." Well, what has he gathered? He's gathered his words, and they're you can see that this verse has 35 words. Again, 35 is God's shorthand number for his words. It's also God's reference to the fullness of grace. But what's incredible is not one of these shall fail. Right here, if you type in these, it's a reference to God's words. The word these comes up 1,225 times, which is 35 times 35, the fullness of God's words. So again, just showing how God codifies just a huge amount of data in his word, or in his book. But at any rate, we have this reference to the Tzaddi being linked to righteousness. But an analysis of Tzaddi in Genesis 1:1 reveals the ends. It's declared from the beginning. Again, there's multiple ends, not just one. We could think of what I like to use is the analogy of headlights on a car, right? Like if you see a car like 4 miles in the distance coming to you, like let's say in the flat of the deserts at night, its headlights will look like it's one light. It'll look like it's one end. But when that car gets closer, you'll see that the headlights, even though they kind of form one light collectively, are actually divided into two different headlights. That's kind of a way that when we look prophetically at the end, is something to consider, is that it is, yes, the end in general, but there are different ends to that end. So just use the analogy of headlights as an example. Whether it's far or near will depend on how you perceive it. And that we often see that in the book of Daniel, prophetically, the way God conveys certain things. But anyway, an analysis of Tzaddi in Genesis 1 reveals the declared from the beginning. Note, the Hebrew has been reflected to correspond with the English. Like I said, Hebrew is read from right to left, but to make things simpler to track here, I flipped it for us Gentiles, or used to reading from left to right, so that we can see how this maps to the English in the beginning. And I put it in the order of the Hebrews, which is why these words are kind of out of order. But basically, it's in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth, and we can see the Aleph Tav, which is a reference to Jesus Christ, being hidden in this verse, the first and the last. There are 7 words and 28 letters in Hebrew, which we can see here. But in the English, there's actually 10 words, again, God's number for time, and 44 letters in English. And 44 is 2 times 22. So again, God declared the end, which is these two 22s, from the beginning, just in the structure of the Bible. And we're going to see now that we could see that these words break down into different values, whether we're looking at the Hebrew or the English. So these are the values for Hebrew, and these are the values for English. Again, we talked about 88 being linked to the end, and we can see that is the English value for heaven. But at any rate, if you take the sum of all the words and letters in Hebrew, it is 2,701, which is 37 times 73. The sum for the English is 411, which is 3 times 137. You guys can read this if you want. I'm going to keep moving along. I will note again that this value is the same value for Genesis 8:14. So there's a connection between this verse and Genesis 8:14. 137 is the starting verse for Tzaddi in Psalms 119, which we looked at earlier. So we even have a reference to Tzaddi being connected to the end, being this 137. But here's where it gets interesting. The last letter for time, again, remember 10 is God's number for time, is the Yod. And there's 3 Yods in this verse. There's a Yod here, here, and here. But the last position is marking the end of time, if you will. If we go to it's the 20th position. Then if we go to the end of the verse, we get its pair, which is the Tzaddi, which is 28. But if you put this marker for time, which is 20, with the last marker at the end, it's 28. God has basically called out 20 and 28. You put those together, you get 2028. 2028 is an end declared from the beginning. And again, the value of Tzaddi is 90. So again, at the end of 2028 is declared in the beginning. The end of 2028 is also declared at the end of the beginning book in the New Testament. 2028 is encoded in reverse in the 2820 notation. The verse begins with word 396 in the chapter. The word world is word 25 in the verse, and word 420, which is 5 times 2 times 20 plus 22 in the chapter. So the rapture and 2 2022s. So again, this is another one I want to show just because it's so powerful. if I go to Matthew 28:20, we'd see that it begins with word 396, which is 2 times 198, so reference to two instances of that 227 date, which is mentioned in verse 198. And the last spoken word by Jesus is the word world. And obviously we have amen, which is the 26th word, which is 2 times 13. Again, the seven thunders is linked to the end. But if we look at the last spoken word by Jesus, it is word 420 and word 25. And again, as I just showed, 420 is the factors that it involves, references the rapture and two 2022s. So again, another way that God is declaring the end from the beginning. In this case, it's the beginning of the New Testament, which is the Gospel of Matthew, and it's declared in the end of that Gospel. And he's even saying the end of the world. He's giving us a powerful clue in the text, but again, he's encoding it in reverse. And again, if you read Hebrew from right to left, as we should, it would be flipped. It would be 2820. The two 2025s are represented with the divided value of Tzaddi. Tzaddi is 45 plus 45. Again, 45 is 20 plus 25. So there's the two 2025s at the end. Furthermore, 28 times 90 is 2,520. These days are the days that we find in the books of Daniel and Revelation. Tzaddi is letter 18 with a gematria value of 90. So again, just quick reference. Here we can see that Tzaddi is the 18th letter, and I think down here it says, usually it says in these things, but I mean, you can find, most of you might know this, that you guys can find charts that show the values of these letters, but at any rate, we know, right here, it has a value of 90. So just wanted to show that for those who may not be familiar with that. But this is another thing that's interesting, is that Tzaddi has a composition value of 60 because it is composed of a bowing noon and a yod. So you have the bent noon here, which is a value of 50, and the yod, which is a value of 10. Actually, I think this is something that this article talks about too. Actually, this is one of the ones I read was talking about this. Oh yeah, right here is even showing it. Yeah, the noon, you have the 50, and you have the yod that's 10. But at any rate, 50 plus 10 is 60. So here's what's amazing. God says, in Isaiah 46:10, God says he declares the end from the beginning. We're in the beginning verse of the Bible. We're at the last letter in that verse. And we already see a link to 28 or 2028 here. And if we add its letter value, which is 18, with its gematria value of 90, we get 108, which is 2 times 27. That, two instances of 227. Furthermore, 18 times 90 is 1,620. Remember, we saw that earlier in our study here. If I go back, I have to go back a ways. Oh yeah, right here. This final verse talking about the rapture, it equals 1,620. When you have book 27 times chapter 12 times verse 5. And so we have a reference to, that factorization here when we just look at the letter and gematria value of Tzaddi. And again, that is 108 times 15, God's number 4 again, which breaks down to 10 times 3 times 2 times 27. Furthermore, if we factorize the letter, the gematria value, and the composition value together, we get 97,200, which is 2025 times 48. 48 is 20 plus 28. So we have a reference to 2025, a convergence, if you will, with 2025 and 2028. Furthermore, if we look at the sum of these with the composition value, you get 168, which is 4 times 20 plus 22. Again, the Lord was at the door but will not proceed in 2022. 2022 is linked to the beginning. We're also looking for the fullness of 24, because remember 24 was that initial date of 227, but it's going to repeat along with the other dates at the end. So basically this is just absolutely mind-blowing to me. A single letter, this just shows how brilliant God is. With a single letter, he has codified all this information that maps to this timeline that he's been revealing since 2022. That basically we have, if we look at the factors of 18 and 90, we have 108 again represented by 15 represented here. We have a reference to 3 227s, and again there's 1, 2, 3 in this timeline that he's laid out, and we have a convergence with 2025 and an encoded reference to 2028, which again in this case we now know from the other aids that God has provided that the convergence of 2025 is this echo or this repeat. And so we have basically all the major milestones on this timeline are basically codified in the letter Tzaddi, the last letter of Genesis 1:1. So again, God declaring from the end from the beginning. The other thing that's interesting is that the cursive form of Tzaddi looks like a 3. Like this is what it looks like in Hebrew, but it basically looks like a 3 to us. And so God's even giving us a clue about, there being these 3 major milestones of the end. And of course, as I already mentioned, the 44 letters that we find in English in the Book of the Lord, the King James Bible, in Genesis 1:1 conceals the 222s, 2 times 22, where it's a reference to the 2022 reset. And so we have a reference to that as well. You have the 2022 reset, the 2025 echo, basically converging, if you will, in their repeated reckonings in 2028. If we just look at the English, we're going to see that it reveals some notable markers of the end as well. The H is the last letter in Genesis 1:1, which positionally corresponds with the last letter in Hebrew, the Tzaddi. Basically, H corresponds with, so we're looking at the letter H here for English, but H would correspond with the Hey, which is the 5th Hebrew letter. However, H is actually the 8th letter in English. Both these numbers are unique on themselves, but if you put 5 and 8 together, you get 58. 58 is God's shorthand number for his voice as a trumpet. And so God's even letting us know that the end is linked to his voice as a trumpet. I'll just there are numerous ways that God shows this. I'm just going to give the shortest, I think it's voice like trumpet. Here's one example. Very first verse of Isaiah 58, cry aloud, spare not, lift up thy voice like a trumpet. There's many other places. For example, if we go to, I intend to do a big study on this again at some point, even though I've covered it in the past because God's shown so much more since then. We go to this rapture typology, which is found in Exodus 19 through 20. It says, and when the voice of the trumpet, this is at Mount Sinai, sounded long, whilst louder and louder Moses spake, and God answered him by a voice. Notice that the word voice repeats twice. And the Lord came down upon Mount Sinai on the top of the mount, and the Lord called Moses up to the top of the mount, and Moses went up. So this is one of the first typologies of the rapture, where we hear the voice of the trumpet, God calls Moses up, and there's this response in verse 20 where Moses goes up. And notice that God does not come all the way down to the base of the mountain, he comes to the top. This is symbolic of him meeting us in the air, not on earth. But at any rate, if you add, you would demark this as 19 through 20. Well, 19 plus 19 plus 20 is 58. And that's, again, as we see here, that is God's shorthand or abbreviated number for his voice as a trumpet. And that is, when we do an analysis of the letter H, we can see that number is formed. So there's even a reference to God's voice as a trumpet at the end. It's worth noting that H flipped upside down, if you flip H upside down, shares a resemblance with the Sophit Tzaddi. Some of you might be able to see that. Again, it's a loose reference, but something that I felt like the Lord pointed out to me that I thought would be worth sharing. The only word to begin with H in Genesis 1:1 is heaven. The letter H in heaven is the 28th letter in the verse in English. So if we just go to the first H here in heaven, it's letter 28. It would positionally correspond with the Hey in Hebrew, because this is where the Hebrew word for heaven, which is letter 17 forward. If we counted here going this way in Hebrew, it'd be the 17th letter. Here's what's amazing. If you put the letter positions of 17 and 28 together, the concatenated result is 1728, which is 4 squared times 108. 4 is God's number for the door. It's also God's number generically for creation, but very often it refers to the door. So we have a reference to the fullness of the door and 108, again, 108 being connected to this in sequence that is connected to 28. The number 1728 is connected to Genesis 8:14. The Hebrew value of the total English sum for Genesis 8:14 is 5,184. I'm just going to show that really quick. So here, I basically took the entire verse, which you can see are in the second month, on the 7th and 20th day of the month, was the earth dried. We saw the Hebrew value earlier of Genesis 8:14. Now we're looking at just the English value. And we can see that it is 5,184 in the Hebrew equivalent. Well, 5,184 is 3 times 1728. So this connection between the English and the Hebrew 1728, which we see here, is actually a factorized or multiplied by 3, is equivalent to the Hebrew equivalent gematria value of Genesis 8:14. And again, this number, though, when we break it down, is 24 times 108 plus 108. And so you have, I believe, a shorthand reference to 2024, which is the first instance of that Genesis 8:14 date, that 227 date. And you have 108. You have one 227 set. Remember, 2 times 27 is 54. 54 plus 54 is 108. So you have one 108 set. And you have another 108 set. Again, 54 plus 54 again here. But you have two sets essentially from 2024. And you can just see that mapped out there. What's interesting, if you reverse this number for Genesis 8:14, it is 4,815, and that is 45 times 107. And if I go here, you can see that the 28th prime number is 107. And so 107 is a reference to 28 prime. So we have a reference to 20 plus 25 and 28 prime when we reverse this, which would be the end over here. Okay, there's that. So yeah, just highlighting that there for you guys. Here's another thing that's interesting. The T is letter 22 in Genesis 1:1. It is a dividing point of the 44 letters in English. The letter T is the 20th letter in English. So basically, when you take the alphabet position of T, which is 20, and you join it with the verse position we see here in Genesis 1:1, which is 22, you get 2022. And so this dividing point of Genesis 1:1 in English essentially has the year 2022 codified in it as well. H is letter 8 in English, and 8 is a number of new beginnings. The beginning H in heaven and ending H in earth look toward another end as well, to a new heaven and a new earth. So it's actually like a double prophecy hidden here. So if we go from, we have, again, H is the 8th English letter. We have 8 and 8 when we look at the two bookends for heaven and earth. Here we see have a new heaven and a new earth mentioned. And we, again, most of you might know that 8 is God's number for new beginnings or new birth, or just God's number for new. It says, and I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth were passed away, and there was no more sea. Well, here's what's amazing. Revelation 21 is chapter 1188 in the Bible. The notation and H values in Genesis 1:1 depict this. The new heaven and new earth were prepared from the beginning. So it's nothing God has declared from the beginning. You have 1, 1, 8, 8. Again, chapter 1188 talks about a new heaven and new earth, and this is from the bookends of heaven and earth. So again, just an incredible amount that God is declaring from the beginning. Letter 44 in English positionally corresponds with letter 28 in Hebrew. The product of these two ends reveals another end. So if you do 28, which again is the 28th, or the last Hebrew letter, times 44, which is the last English letter, you get 1,232, and that is 11 times 112. 11 is God's number for blessing or cursing. It has a twofold application. But basically, there's some notable factors I want to point out. 112 is 8 times 14. 176 is 11 times 16. Again, Genesis 8:14 provides the end date of 227. That date, 227 and 2028, is on 11:16. And actually, that's one thing I might show, just show some receipts for that. Heshvan 27, 2028. Okay, so I have to go down to November. So, yeah, right here. 27th of Heshvan, which is, again, Heshvan is now what would have been 227 in Noah's time, is November 16th in 2028. And literally, God is Heshvan 27 is the day that is mentioned in Genesis 8:14. And that day in 2028 is on November 16th or 11/16, which is the other factor set we have here when we multiply the end of the English with the end of the Hebrew. So now we're going to look at this verse again. Genesis 8:14, and the second month on the 7th and 20th day of the month was the earth dried. Again, the Hebrew value of Genesis 8:14 is 2,701. It has the same value as Genesis 1:1, which I already talked about. It also ends with the same word as Genesis 1:1. Consequently, it also has Tsade as the end of the verse. So again, we have the fishing hook, the Tsade, at the end of Genesis 8:14 as well. In Hebrew, Genesis 8:14 has 8 words and 35 letters. In English, Genesis 8:14 has 18 words and 70 letters, which you can see up here. The product of the end word and letter count for English is 1,260. So basically, if you take this, it has 70 letters. It's the 18th word. If you multiply those together, you get 1,260. And that is 28 times 45. So again, you guys pointed to 28 and 20 plus 25, or 2025 being linked to the end. The product of the end word and letter count for Hebrew is 280. So here's the Hebrew. It's the 35th letter in Hebrew, the 8th word in Hebrew. 8 times 35 is 280, and that is 10 times 28, or the time of 28. Another thing that's interesting is the sum of the end word and letter count for English is 88. So 70 plus 18 is 88. We're going to see as we get into the Back to the Future with the 88 miles per hour reference how this comes up. But basically 88 is basically symbolic of this route to the end. And really it is a route because, and the reason the word dried is so important is it's conceptually making a bridge to the typology of the Passover in the Exodus. Remember, they went over on dry ground through the parted sea. And I covered this in other studies, but this word dried is actually connected to the dry earth references we find in the Exodus account, where the children basically escape out of Egypt on dry ground, the parted sea. So basically, God is bridging, if you will. So in that sense, if we want to say that the rapture is connected to any feast day, in this particular case, it would be connected to Passover and Resurrection Day. But actually, God, through the time of God's range, he actually weaves and connects many of the feast days into his plan for the end, but ultimately they're all converging in these dates that are linked to the flood. And that shouldn't surprise us, since the Lord told us that his coming would be like the days of Noah. But at any rate, we have an 88 reference here, and if we add these values, you have 43, which again, we talked about earlier. 43 is 23 plus 20. It's a reference to that 2023 reversal sequence that is linked to the blessing of the rapture. So here I'm just going to isolate the last words for Genesis 8:14 and Genesis 1:1, so you can see it's the same word in both verses. They both end with the same word. They just, because of the sentence structure, they have different counts for letters and words. Again, just as a reminder, they both have the same value. Genesis 8:14 and Genesis 1:1 both have a value of 2,701. But what's interesting is that when we look at just as we did a sum here to get 88, we could see that if we take the word count plus the letter count in English, we get a sum of 54 in Genesis 1:1, and 54 is 2 times 27. So even, again, once again, God's declaring the end is 227 through these factorizations. And then here's another interesting thing. If we look at these two bridge verses, these two connected verses, Book 1, Chapter 1, Verse 1, plus Book 1, Chapter 8, Verse 14 is 2 by book, 9 by chapter, 15 by verse. If you factorize those or multiply those to get a product, you get 270, and that is breaks down to 5 times 2 times 27, or the Rapture, 227. And so God is, through these 2 bridge verses, even given us a clue that the Rapture is linked to 227. The sum of the end word. Okay, I already went through that. There's a lot of information, and so taking it as it comes. The product of the letter count for Genesis 1:1 and 8:14 is 3080. So if you take remember there's 70 English letters in Genesis 8:14, there's 44 English letters in Genesis 1:1. And again, like in the King James Bible, which is the book of the Lord that Isaiah 34:16 prophesies, you're going to have these precise counts. You're not going to have these precise counts in the NIV, ESV, or even in the New King James Version. You're not going to have these precise counts. It's only in the book of the Lord that you're going to have these precise counts. But at any rate, 44 times 70 is 3080, and that is 35 times 88. Again, 35 is 7 times 5. Fullness of grace, as we saw earlier, is also a reference to God's words. And 88, as we talked about earlier, is 2 times 22, a witness to the 2 bookends of that reset event. The connection between 88 and the fullness of grace is illustrated in a fishing story related aid that God arranged. It can be found in a picture story update God created in the earth and revealed in 2022. This is something I've covered pretty thoroughly in a lot of other videos. I will, again, link in the description below some videos that talk about this. There's a series called Revealed Unto Babes that I will link, which gives an overview of this. I'm just going to do a quick synopsis. But basically, back in 2022, through a series of events that God arranged, he showed me that these constellations that we see in the sky have corresponding geographic features on the earth. And so here we can see, I've highlighted some of the significant constellations. We have the constellation of Cetus or Leviathan. You have the 2 fish. You have the constellation of the Lamb, which is representative of the Lamb of God, Jesus Christ. You have the bound woman, which is representative of those in bondage, which would be Israel under the bondage of works, and even legalistic Christians. You have the fish on the right, which is the fish of Ephraim. It's symbolic of the church. You have the fish on the left, which is the fish of Judah, which is heading towards bondage, which is the representative of Israel and legalistic followers. But at any rate, you can see, again, I'll just show this really quickly in Google Earth. I've overlaid the constellations here. If I go to the constellations here in Stellarium, again, this is a program that any of you guys can load. You can see we have, the ram, the fish, the maiden, Perseus, and up above them we have Draco and, you know what, I'm going to go back to a different date or a different time of year to make this easier to see. It'll make the comparisons easier. All right, so yeah, you have the ram, the fish, you have Leviathan, and then up above them you have the dragon and Hercules, which is actually, in the Hebrew Mazzaroth, is the mighty man of Judah, which is a reference to Christ. He's the one who crushes the head of the dragon, which he did out the cross already. We'll look at 11/16/2028 later, because we're going to see that there's a new moon in the scales along with the sun. This is symbolic of the scales of time being balanced. We also have Jupiter and Venus along with the grain harvest with the woman. So anyway, we'll look at that later. But basically, that's a significant convergence. What I've done here in Google Earth is I've taken those constellations and I've overlaid them with our counterparts so you can see how they line up. But again, the most important one for our purposes here is this fish on the right, which is known as the fish of Ephraim. And remember, Ephraim was the second-born Gentile son of Joseph. We are second-born in the sense that we are born again, and the church is mostly Gentile. This is symbolic of the church. It is the fish on the right. Remember, Jesus said in John 21, cast your net on the right side, because the right represents the church. The church is gathered first before Israel, which is on the left. But at any rate, we're going to see how the fit, when you overlay these, that the mouth of the fish would be near Chicago. And so with that in mind, we're going to jump back into this. So again, I'm just showing here that you can see how you have these constellations. You can see just how these fit right into these shapes of the Earth. I guess I could show that again really quick. if I go down here, you can see that the constellation of the Dragon matches this shallow sea shelf that surrounds Florida. However, the sea shelf doesn't extend to the head. And that's because this is like a status update for us. The head of the Dragon was crushed by Jesus Christ on the cross, and so it has this depression where the head should be now. But you can see that this constellation fits inside the Caribbean Sea here. And with his foot on Cuba, there's a lot of typological information that's embedded in this, so I'm not going to get into it right now. But basically, there are all these picture stories throughout the earth. For example, here's another one where the constellation Serpens actually matches the Snake River with one change at the end, which is some information that God provides. And the scales when you map out what God has these parallel counterparts, the scales would map this part of Utah, and one of the scales has the Salt Sea on it. So you have salt in one scale, and you have a gold hill on the other scale. So God's gold hill's on the other scale. God is trying to balance the scales to bring forth, the proper balancing of accounts of time before He comes, and that's all conveyed in this. But at any rate, you can see the shallow sea shelf here around Florida, which maps to the constellation Draco. You can see how the Great Lakes, when you look at them upside down, again, we're looking at the Earth upside down, map to these subset of constellations. With, again, there's a change because the constellations are God's story at the beginning. At the beginning of time, that the net of fish was not full. That's why it's kind of just pinched together here. Now that we're at the end, when God is revealing this to us, the two fish, which are represented by the two lakes, are bulging outward, which is symbolic of a full net of fish, which we read about in John 21 with 153 fish that they catch. And so God is letting us know that we're near that harvest point of the end, where God is going to gather the fish, and fish represent souls in Scripture, and bring them to Himself. And so, anyway, with that in mind, again, we can see that the fish on the right is the important one. It's the fish of Ephraim, which is symbolic of the born-again church. It maps to Lake Michigan in God's picture story in the earth. So now here we're just looking at Lake Michigan, but on its side, so we can see the fish and laid out for us. We can see that the mouth is where Chicago would be, and we can see that two of the major highways that head into Chicago are Highway 90. Remember, Tsade has a value of 90, and 88, which is another number we see recurring. So again, I'm just reiterating that here in this slide, that the mouth of the fish is there. We have 88 and 90 heading into that. What's interesting to know is I-88 terminates at an intersection with I-80. That's important because 80 years are mentioned in Psalms 90:10. So basically 1948 plus 80 years comes to 2028, which is an end encoded in Genesis 1:1. In Matthew 24, Jesus says, learn the parable of the fig tree. Throughout Scripture, the fig tree represents Israel. Well, Israel became planted again in 1948. In Psalms 90:10, again, 90:10, it mentions a generation being 80 years. Well, 80 plus 1948 is 2028. But what's interesting is I-88 and I-90 represent a hook that will catch the church in the rapture. So again, the Tzaddi 90, as we saw, actually derives from a fishing hook from the Zod. And these highways basically match a non-Sophite Tzaddi on its side, the fishing hook. And so it's kind of, hopefully you guys can see that here. You even have these two cities anchored at the top, Milwaukee and Madison. There's actually some interesting things I saw that were connected to this when I was looking into it. But again, there's so much that could be covered that I'm just going to kind of go through. The other thing that's interesting is that it's like the Tzaddi's been squished or shortened if you look at the highways, like it's compressed this way. I might touch on that later, but I believe that is related to the shortened years. Jesus said, except for those days had been shortened, no flesh should be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. But at any rate, we have, again, a reference to the Tzaddi, the last, which has a value of 90, which is the last letter in Genesis 1:1. And as we saw earlier back here, we saw that the 88 is the last sum value for Genesis 8:14. So we have 88 and 90 are both pointing towards an end, and both those are major highways that head into Chicago, which is where the mouth of the fish would be when we overlay it on top of the earth. But what's pretty amazing is when we factorize these two, when you get 88 times 90, it's 7,920, and that is 45 times 176, and it's also 10 times 2 times 396. So we have, again, 198 plus 198, which is, again, that's Genesis 8:14 is verse 198 in the Bible, is 396. But we're looking at two sets of 396 to get to the end. Additionally, that's also 45 is 20 plus 25. We're looking at that 2025 echo being linked to the end. And so again, I'm just showing that here that we have two sets of 396. The sum of the English word and letter counts for Genesis 1:1, as we saw earlier, is 54, which is 2 times 27. Again, 10 words plus 44 letters. That particular date, 227, is on 11/16 and 2028, as we saw, and 176 is 11 times 16. It's also 176 is also the highest verse in the Bible. It is in Psalms 119. I'm going way too far down because it's up here. So as we can see, we're in Psalms 119. We can see it's the longest chapter in the Bible. It has 176 verses. So that's the highest verse count. But also begins, it's the Tav, which is the 22nd Hebrew letter, and it begins in verse 169. 13 squared is 169, so 13 times 13 is 169. We're going to see how that comes up again as we look at the Back to the Future typology. And so there's all these, that's the fullness of the seven thunders connected to 22, the 22nd Hebrew letter, and it ends in 176, which is 16 times 11 or 11 times 16. So just some interesting connections to take note of. Again, that date is the 227 and 2028. And here's where, again, we talked about Psalms 90 earlier. This is just amazing what God teaches us here. So remember, teach us to number our days. Remember, we looked at earlier in Matthew, and this is just this grand puzzle that God has laid out. It's just so amazing what God has laid out. The word teaching, which is the very first word in Matthew 28:20, is 396 in the chapter. So with that in mind, we're going to see some interesting connections. So teach us to number our days. So God's talking about numbering our days, that we may apply our hearts unto wisdom. This is Psalms 90. Remember, 90 is the value of Tsade, the last letter in Genesis 1:1. 12, there are 12 months in a year. Basically, through this riddle that God is providing, it actually is possible to number our days. It says the initial appointed time can be numbered in Psalms 90:12. Book 19 plus chapter 90 plus verse 12 is 121. 121 is 11 times 11. Psalms 90:12 is the 420th verse that the word days occurs in. The initial appointed time was 11:11 in 2022. And so if we if we look at the numbers God has codified here, we actually can number our days, and the initial appointed time was 11:11 in 2022. And so God has basically provided a puzzle, or a riddle, if you will, that's concealed in this verse. If we number these things according to how He teaches us, remember He's the one that has to teach us these things, we will be able to see the appointed times, to see the number of our days. The other thing that's worth noting is that November 11th was 217 on the antediluvian calendar of Noah's time, and that verse in the Bible is verse 171 in the Bible. The beginning of the name of the Lord, when read from left to right, is 171. Actually, the 171 is even represented here as well. So this is, for those of you who don't know, this is the Tetragrammaton. It is the name of the Lord in Hebrew, Yud He Vav He, and you have a 1, 7, and a 1 concealed in His name, actually twice. There's some significance to that as well. Basically, God, even in His name, has declared the end, at least the initial end. It's worth noting that the word number in Psalms 90:12 is the word 406,254 in the Bible. I'm just going to show that again really quick. Where did it? Oh. Okay, yes, right here. So you can see it's 406, 254. So what's interesting, just when we break that down, 406 is the triangle number of 28. So if I go to here, or actually, we can see that the 28th triangle number is 406, right there. So 406 is a reference to this pinnacle, if you will, this triangle peak, if you will, of 2028. 254 can be seen as 2 and 54, or 254s. And we have, two 54s or two 227s mapped out that are linked to 28. Additionally, T, when we look at T28 to represent the triangle number 28, is the 20th English letter. So T28 actually can be seen as 2028. It's worth noting too that 406 is the area code for Montana, and we're gonna see why that's important. Because again, as we see, God is using geography, the Great Lakes, for example, to convey this picture story for us. With these highways, Montana is part of this greater story that God is showing. Montana became the 41st state on 11/8/1889. 11 times 8 is 88. Again, a reference to this end. 41 is the 13th prime number, and 1889 is basically 10 times 10 prime. So this fullness of time being represented with this. Washington also became a state in 1889. So there's two states that became states in 1889. One was Montana. The other, interestingly, is Washington, which is where Interstate 90 begins. It became a state in 1889, and it became the 42nd state on November 11th. So, again, God is using history and geography to convey all these hidden things. Because, again, 42 is 20 plus 22. November 11th was that initial appointed day. And I think of Washington, a ton is 2,000 years. There's been 2,000 years of the church age that are involved to get to the end. Again, I-90 begins at I-5 in Washington and passes through Montana on its way to the mouth of the fish. But it also, between Washington and Montana, you have Idaho, which is the 43rd state. It's also worth noting that the ordinal English value of Washington is 130, and that is 10 times 13, the time of the seven thunders. On another note, if you go to Psalms 122, many of you know that each psalm maps to a year in the 1900s onward. For example, Psalm 1 would map to 1901, Psalm 4 would map to 1904. Well, Psalm 122 would map to 2022, because 1900 plus 122 is 2022. So yeah, 1900 plus 122 equals 2022. So this psalm would map to 2022, and it says, I was glad when they said unto me, let us go into the house of the Lord. Our feet shall stand within thy gates, Jerusalem. So basically it's talking about us going to the house of the Lord, but obviously we did not go into the house of the Lord in 2022. The key is what is encoded in this. There are, as you can see, there are 130 words in this psalm. 130 is 10 times 13. So God has given us a clue that the time that we go into his house is not the first 2022, but in this other 2022 that is connected to the time of the seven thunders. Likewise, we see that in this, where did I go? This, just the encoded value of Washington becoming the 42nd state on November 11th. There's also a clue that it wasn't, even though it was the initial appointed time, that it doesn't speak until the time of the seven thunders. Again, the English ordinal value of Washington is 130. But what I want to point out, though, is that Idaho is between those two states, just as the 2023 reversal is lying between the initial 11/11/2022 appointment and the time of the seven thunders event. Again, because it's the 2023 reversal is the sequence leading up to the rapture. It's the time filling the gap between, if you will. And it's worth noting that I-90 extends for 73 miles in Idaho, and Idaho became a state on July 3rd, or 7/3. again, that 7.3 is related to the 7.3 window as well. I-90 is 3,100 miles in length, and that is, I'll just show that actually really quick. If I could spell. Actually, yeah, so you can see here it's basically, well, 3,099.7. So basically 3,100 miles if we round up. And 3,100 it's also by the way, it's also the longest highway in the United States. That is 5 times, which is God's number for the Rapture, times 620, which we saw earlier is the time of the hourglass. It's also how many times the word time occurs in Scripture. So just an interesting connection there. Idaho, which again is state 20 plus 23, state 43, is connected to states 33, 36, 41, 42, 44, and 45. So it's connected to all these numbers that are prophetically significant when we look at just the statehood. And so if we go to Google Earth, you can see Idaho. It's also connected to the sequence of the serpent, which I've talked about in other videos. But you have state 42, 33, you have 41, you have 44, you have 45, and I think 36 here surrounding it. And there's a lot of things that are, God has basically codified it in this picture story of the end. Likewise, the 2023 reversal sequence is linked to God's promises, which is represented by 33, the consummation, which is represented by 36, the seven thunders, again, which is 41 is 13 prime, 2022, which again, watching in this state 42, 2024, 44 could also equal 20 plus 24, the 2022 reset, which we see here, and the fruit of grace and the rapture, again, 45 is 9 times 5, and 2025, which is 20 plus 25. So again, Utah, it should be noted that Utah is the 45th state, and that's where the scales are. 45 again is 20 plus 25, but again, there's one of the things God showed is that if we map this out, Interstate 84 connects from the end of the Snake River here, which maps to this constellation Serpens, and there's a town called Echo where it ends on 84. There's another town called Echo at the end of Highway 84, which also meets with Highway 80, which we talked about being significant earlier, at the top of the scales there on this side, correcting the salt side of the scale, if you will. And 84, obviously, as we talked about, is 2 times 42. It represents the two 2022s. And so there's all these things that God provided in these real-world aids that is showing how this is laid out. So again, as I mentioned, though, Idaho became a state in 1890, and has, when you know it, Tsade is letter 18 with a value of 90. That number 1890 is significant as it is 3 times 7 times 90. Furthermore, it is 42 times 45. So we could see that it is linked to 2022 and 2025. And again, both those are linked via the reset, and the echo are linked to this end that we apparently appears to reside in 2028 with everything that God is showing at this time. Again, 1890 is also 7 times 5, the fullness of grace, times 2 times 27. And so 227 would be that pivotal end for the fullness of grace. And many of these gems that God has shown were shown in Idaho. Idaho is actually known as the gem state. One thing that's interesting is if I type in, if I just look at if I can type the values for Idaho, you can see that the simple English value is 37, which is that the numbers 3 and 7 are related to that prophetic address for the period of Tarian, and this sequence linked, this window, if you will, for the seven thunders, and 222, as we talked about, is linked to 2022, and that the sequence that began in 2022 leading up to the end. There's some other significance to 72 as well, but I'll save that for another time. So again, this shows how sovereign God is, that all the name of states, the borders of countries and states, all these things aren't just happenstance. They're all under God's sovereign purview. and he uses all of them for his glory. And basically all of his creation is points to this elaborate puzzle that is pointing to, if you will, the consummation of all things, to God's redemptive plan coming in, to fruition. And Wyoming shares the 1890 statehood year and is state 44, which is 2 times 22. So there's another state, Wyoming, which also has this 1890 year statehood year, and it happens, I say happens, to be state 44, which is 2 times 22. And it became a state on July 10th in 1890. 7 times 10 times 1890 is 5, God's number for the rapture. 21 again is 3 times 7, or 7 times 3, that window of the end, times 20 plus 25 times 28. So we have just another reference to what God is encoding just in his sovereignty. Furthermore, 1890 is 5 times 378. 5 is God's shorthand number for the rapture. And as we saw earlier, 378 is the last word by chapter in verse 198, which is the verse that mentions the 227 date. The word wisdom occurs in 222 verses. Again, reference to the sequence of the end, and it is word 15 in Psalms 90:12. And 15, as we talked about earlier, is one of God's numbers for again, so God is indicating that 2022 and 2025 occur again. The product of Psalms 90:12, including wisdom, reveals a convergence of the end. So if you take book 19 times chapter 90 times verse 12 times word 15, you get 307,800. And that is 19 times 8 times 2025. So 19 is God's number for voice or speak. Actually, we saw a little hint of that earlier when we were looking at Exodus. Oops. If I could click on things. Holy cow, my fingers are not working. So we're in Exodus 19, verse 19. And it's talking about, it mentions voice, which is represented by 19 twice. And so we're 1919, it has voice twice. Furthermore, like another good example is, many of you will be familiar with, if I go to 1 Kings 19, we have this famous passage of Isaiah where he hears a still small voice. It's the thematic of this chapter is about Elijah, I'm sorry, trying to hear the voice of the Lord. And so anyway, throughout Scripture, God makes it clear that 19 is associated with his voice or speaking. And so when we looked at this factor, it's looking at this moment of God's voice or speaking, and it's being linked to 8, which is God's number for something that's new, and 2025. And so we're looking for God's voice to speak in a new 2025, which in this case we know would be this echo or this repeat of 2025. Furthermore, it is 19 times 100 times 3 times 2 times 27, or God speaks the fullness of time, 10 squared, which is 100, times 3, 1, 2, 3, times 227. And so we have the reference to 3 227s. And again, here, the days of our years are 3 square years and 10, and if by reason of strength they be 4 square years, that is their strength, labor, and sorrow, for it is soon cut off and we fly away. So we have a reference to 80 here, and again, 80 is intersecting with 88 here, which leads to 90. And the phrase cut off is word or phrase 198 in the chapter. Again, reference to that verse of the 227 date, which we see here. And it talks about flying away, and that's what we are looking forward to in the rapture, right? Is this moment that we fly away to be with the Lord. The last mention of the phrase fly away is in book 28, which is Hosea. As for Ephraim, now remember, this fish that we're looking at is known as the fish of Ephraim in the Hebrew constellations, or rather in God's constellations. It's symbolic of the church. And so we have the last reference to fly away, and it's talking about Ephraim. And it's a twofold thing, because God is talking to both the tribe of Ephraim and the type of Ephraim. So it says, as for Ephraim, their glory shall fly away like a bird from the birth. And remember, that's why we started this whole study with the birth of the man-child, right? Talking about the man-child being caught up, or her child being caught up to God and to his throne. It It's talking about a birth from the womb and from the conception. We read about the womb, the fruit of the womb, in Isaiah, among other places. Isaiah 66:9, I believe it was. But at any rate, we have this reference to us flying away. Now, for the tribe of Ephraim, the northern tribes of Israel, because they fell into idolatry and sin and rebelled against God, he's basically conveying that their glory was going to depart from them, that they were going to lose their glory. However, God is concealing a hidden prophecy for the church, which is represented by the type of Ephraim, where he's alluding to this yet future event where we fly away in glory, like a bird, from the birth or from this event that is the rapture. The phrase "fly away" is word phrase 7 of 22 in the verse. So there's 22 words in this verse, again, because it's linked to that 22 reset. Hosea 9:11 is verse 22,220 in the Bible. And so, again, you have some reference to 20, and this number breaks down to 10 times 2222. And so you have a reference to the 222s, if you will, encoded in this verse. But furthermore, if you take this verse, book 28 times chapter 9 times verse 11, it equals 7 times 396, the fullness of 396, which is this last set that we see here. And as I mentioned earlier, Matthew 28:20 begins with the word 396 in the chapter, which is the word teaching. The 25th and last mention of the word teaching is in Titus 2:12, which is verse 28 in Titus. The word teaching is word 527 in Titus. Again, 527 represents the rapture of the church, 5 and 27. So the Lord has been teaching us about the rapture of the church now that we're at this time of the end. It was declared in the beginning, but God is continuing to teach us now at the end. Everything that he's basically arranged in this elaborate puzzle to convey his redemptive plan. Titus 2:12 is verse 6,776 in the New Testament, and it is followed by the verse of the blessed hope. But this verse is 7 times 11. Again, Genesis 7:11 was the verse that contains the initial appointed time, and 88 again is the route to the end, represented here. It's also 14, which is God's number for Passover. It could be our Passover event, times 22 times 22. So again, the 222s. And we're looking for that blessed hope and the glorious appearing of the great God and our Savior Jesus Christ. And that's 2:13. Again, the reference to that seven thunders event where the Lord appears. And we're going to see how the seven thunders is a theme that comes up in Back to the Future when we get to that study. So with that, there's just one more small study I want to do before we jump into the study that's going to talk about lead up to the Back to the Future analysis. It's the 2022 reset in the whirlwind. So as we talked about already, 84 is one of God's numbers for the 2022 reset. It equals 2 times 42. We see this encoded here. 38 is God's number for the whirlwind. Job 38:1 exemplifies this mapping. It says, then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. Again, it's in the very first verse of chapter 38. We'll see that 38 is God's number for the whirlwind. With that in mind, though, Ezekiel 38 is chapter 840 in the Bible, and 840 is 10 times 84, the time of the 2022 reset. Many of you who study prophecy know that Ezekiel 38 is obviously a very significant chapter, prophetically speaking. Ezekiel 38 begins with the word 558,258 in the Bible, and that is 3 times 38 times 83 times 59. There's a lot going on there, but basically 38 again is God's number for the whirlwind, and the whirlwind is linked to the end of the 2023 reversal, and 83 is 23 prime. So it's another way that is encoded. Psalms 83 prophetically conveys the lead up to the whirlwind, which again is represented by 38, which is in there basically, you can see how they're flipped. Hopefully you can see that. Psalms 83 ends with verse 18. We see this here. The Lord's fury rising up is mentioned in verse 18 of Ezekiel 38. Again, 18 is letter 18 in Hebrew is Tzaddi. And it shall come to pass at the same time when Gog shall come up against the land of Israel, saith the Lord God, that my fury shall come up on my face. This is Ezekiel 38, 18. It's also worth noting that 38 plus 18 is 56. 56 is 2 times 28. Referenced a witness, if you will, to that 28 event. Ezekiel 38:18 is verse 21,444 in the Bible. Again, if we split that, we could see 21, which is that 3-7 or 7-3 window. 444 is 12 times 37. So another, the year of this 37 event. Ezekiel 38:18 is verse 979 in Ezekiel. Visually, we could see 9, the number of fruit, and 79, which is the 22nd prime number. It's also 11, God's number for blessing or cursing, and 24 prime, which again, that sequence of 22 initially appeared to end in 2024, but we know 2024 then rolled over into 2025, which is now going to repeat, if you will, at a later point that presently appears to be linked to 2028. The 2022 reset is one of the greatest mysteries of the end. It represents 2 reckonings of 2022. Thus, we might expect verse 4044 in the Bible to conceal something related to the 2 2022s, since 4044 equals 2 times 2022. Verse 4044 in the Bible is Numbers 11:19, and it conceals a reference to the whirlwind. It says, "Ye shall not eat 1 day, nor 2 days, nor 5 days, neither 10 days, nor 20 days." Again, at first, it doesn't look like there's anything going on here that's related to the end, but again, God is brilliantly encoding something here. Basically, 1 plus 2 plus 5 plus 10 plus 20 is 38, which is God's number for the whirlwind. So God is basically saying, creating a little bit of a number story here. This verse from the book of Numbers conceals a clever number story. The sum of all the days is 38, the number of the whirlwind. Those not found in the Lord at his return will eat or reap the whirlwind in judgment and God's wrath. However, those found in Jesus Christ will be taken in the whirlwind. And that's something we should all long for, right? Is to be found in Jesus Christ. And that's the most important thing. If you're watching this, you're not sure if you're saved or not. You need to make sure you have a relationship with Jesus Christ, the one who died and rose again from the dead, the one who made a way to save us. And so that's the most important thing that you can take out of this entire video is exciting as it is to see these mysteries that God is unsealing at the time of the end. The most important thing is salvation. And so now is the time to turn to the Lord. With that said, we're going to continue this study and see this connection between the whirlwind and the rapture. We're going to see this with the story of Elijah. It says, "And it came to pass as they still went on and talked, behold, there appeared a chariot of fire and horses of fire, and parted them both asunder, and Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven." So this is a typology of the rapture, and Elijah's going up into whirlwind, up into heaven by a whirlwind. And when you know it, there are 38 words in 2 Kings 2:11. It mentions a whirlwind. There's 38 words in the verse, which is the number of a whirlwind. There are 18 words. Conversely, there are 18 words in Numbers 11:19, which is one of the numbers for heaven, which actually is mentioned down here. But so there's like this cross connection, if you will, between these two verses. But with that said, there's other things that are encoded. 2 times 11 is 22, and obviously the prefix of 2 indicates that there are 2 of them. So there's an encoded reference to that. The 22nd mention of whirlwind is found in Hosea 8:7, which is verse 22,202 in the Bible, but it can look like 2:22:02. It says, "For they have sown the wind, and they shall reap the whirlwind. It hath no stalk, the bud shall yield no meal. If so be it yield, the stranger shall swallow it up." Now this is talking about those who do not turn to the Lord. Again, Hosea is book 28 in the Bible, and 8 times 7 is 2 times 28. Hosea 8:7 is verse 107 in Hosea, which is basically 28 prime. And Hosea has 197 verses, which is 20 plus 25 prime. The whirlwind is linked to 2022, 2025, and 2028. Again, this is the 22nd time that the word whirlwind occurs, and it is this verse that it occurs in. Basically, 2202 encodes 2 2022s in reverse. Basically, if you flip this, you can see that it is 2022-2, that there's 2 of them. Brilliantly, the 2 times 2022 verse in the Bible encodes a reference to the whirlwind via the sum of 38, which we saw earlier. And a reference to the word whirlwind, is found in the 22,202 verse of the Bible, which again represents that same, expression, just, flipped. So God is making a connection between the two 2022s and a whirlwind. So with that said, I think we could get on finally to the setup, if you will, for the Back to the Future typology.